we'll be extremely blessed by doing this. So we'll look at our text today. Title of the sermon is The Opening of the Book of Hebrews at Many Times and in Many Ways. And we'll open up and we'll read from Hebrews chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. Long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. But in these last days, He has spoken to us by His Son, whom He appointed the heir of all things, through whom He also created the world. He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of His nature. And He upholds the universe by the word of His power. And after making purification for sins, He sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high, having become as much superior to angels as the name He has inherited is more excellent than theirs. Looking at these opening first 4 verses, something might be obvious to us, and typically when we turn to a new letter in the Bible, the typical introduction of a normal letter is, hello, my name is Paul. I'm writing this to the church and so, grace and peace be to you guys. There's a greeting and there's a typical opening. Just for fun, let's look at Ephesians chapter 1 and verse 1, the opening of that epistle. Hey, this is Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ by the will of God, to the saints who are in Ephesus and are faithful in Christ, grace to you and peace. The author introduces himself. He acknowledges the church that he's writing to, and then there is a typical blessing, grace and peace. That's a pat opening. That's kind of the way we start our letters. Dear so-and-so, hope this letter finds you doing well. But if we come back and we look at Hebrews, notice that there's none of that. The author doesn't tell us who he is, so we don't know who the author of Hebrews is. There's speculation. It's quite popular to say Paul wrote it, but we don't know that he did. It's quite popular to say Apollos wrote it, a gifted orator. The Bible tells us Apollos was a gifted orator, a good speaker. And I think there's a text that says Paul maybe was not that great of a speaker, not that powerful with words. But this guy is very powerful with words. Whoever wrote this, it would be worth noting that Hebrews chapter 1, verses 1 through 4 is one singular sentence in the original language. When it gets translated into English, they've broken it into several sentences. But this is important for us. It's one sentence that has been carefully constructed and worked out to have a big impact, an oral impact on the audience that's hearing it. Let me give you a quote here. The author uses elegant language in this majestic overture, which is both rhetorically eloquent and theologically full to overflowing. That word theologically full is going to be very important for us because the things that the author of Hebrews makes known to us are very, very significant things that expose other congregations that are doing things inappropriately and incorrectly. So we may have to, in absorbing this text, we may have to come to terms with some realistic issues that other types of churches and denominations have gotten incorrect. That's what the book of Hebrews is going to do. He's going to set things straight. Just a couple of things. I don't want to get too much into the original language because it's not going to benefit most of us. But there's something unique about the way he wrote these first 4 lines, this sentence. he begins several of the words with the letter P. So he's carefully constructed this opening so that there are 5 P words kind of closely together, and that would have a sensation on the listener. I can't duplicate it for you in the English, but it would be kind of like Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. Okay, that's what the Greek sounds like. It would be memorable. It would stick in your brain. You would even, if you're half asleep, you might even look up and open your eyes at that moment. So it's a very unique little piece of text. One single sentence that has been carefully put together and constructed. Here's another quote for you. It was the habit of the Greek orators, like Demosthenes, the greatest of them all, to weave such sonorous words into the first paragraph of a speech. The writer to the Hebrews felt that since this letter was to speak of the supreme revelation of God, then the ideas must be clothed in the noblest language that it was possible to find. Something very special about these 4 verses. I tried to piece something together to you that might kind of bring home why I want these first 4 verses to have an impact on us and to recognize that they were carefully constructed, because the first opening words of a sentence are sometimes the most memorable words. And all it takes is quoting those first couple of words, and people will automatically remember the rest of it. So some of the examples that I would draw to your attention, similar speeches that had been given, President Lincoln, 77 years ago. Those words were carefully chosen to open his inaugural address. Ronald Reagan, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall. Martin Luther King, I have a dream. And that's what we are looking at today in Hebrews. Long ago, at many times and in many ways. We need to make that special. I would maybe even demarcate that opening phrase. But all of verses 1 through 4, I would put a bracket around verses 1 through 4, and we want to put effort into making that opening verse special, because it was designed and constructed to be special to us. We can't experience the text in the original language, so we're going to try to figure out if we can experience the text with what we've been given in the English. And so I recommend that this is what we do. I'll give you this throughout the sermon, but throughout the week, you'll want to review this and make it your own to make this opening statement special to you. Without work and effort, it's not going to mean much to you. So here we are, the sermon topics. In verse 1, be able to figure out what he has to say about the past. In verse 2, look at the pronouns and launch yourself off of each pronoun to see what God is saying, because in verse 2, the pronouns are about God, and He did this, and He said this, and He made this. And then in verses 3 through 4, the pronouns switch to Jesus. And He does this, and He is this, and He... I think that's the best way, since we don't know the original language, to use the English to get value, is follow the pronouns. So let's start in verse 1. What does he say? What does he have to say about the past? Verse 1, long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. So long ago is significant. We're going to put the book of Hebrews around 64 AD, anytime in the 60s. Significantly, the book of Hebrews was written before the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in AD 70. He's acting like the priests and the chief priests and the sacrifices are still happening in his day. So when he says long ago, he is speaking about the prophets, because the last prophet to speak in his day was the prophet Micah or Malachi. Look at the last book before Matthew, Malachi, right? Malachi, correct. So from his vantage point, the last of the prophets was the prophet Malachi, and Malachi wrote 400 years before Christ, in the 400s BC. So it's been 400 years since anybody has heard from God. And that's the way it was long ago, back in those days. But then comes John and Jesus, and that's exactly what he's going to allude to. Long ago, back in those days, before, from Micah back, that's what he's referring to. This phrase, at many times, you may want to put a parenthesis around that phrase. It's very, very significant. At many times, many, yeah, that's a good word. Many times. What does that mean? And he's referring to many times is in those old days in the past, God gave us little snippets. He would say one little thing in this moment in time. He would give another little moment in time and say this. So in the old way of doing things, God spoke to our fathers through the prophets bit by bit. Little piece of information here, little piece of information there. It was a fragmented fashion, and God had to repeatedly show up and speak to different prophets and give them little snippets for their day and age. Many times in a repeated fashion. That's the way God used to speak to us, or to our fathers, he would say. Notice, for example, in 1 Samuel chapter 3, verse 1, now the word of the Lord was rare in those days. There was no frequent vision. And so in those days, the patriarchs and the fathers and the prophets, they were constantly waiting with bated breath, we would say, when is God going to say something again? When is God going to speak to us again? When is he going to give us another little tidbit of information? Fragmented, piecemeal. That's the way it was back then. Every message was incomplete, and it left the listeners wanting more. Then when we go to the next phrase, in many ways. This is another one of the P's in his sentence. Many ways. So many times, many ways. The many ways is he's talking about God would often communicate ideas in many different ways. We're going through the prophet Isaiah on Wednesdays, and we had a bit of a surprise to recognize what the first 6 chapters of Isaiah is doing. And the first 6 chapters of Isaiah, almost each chapter, God is giving Isaiah a message, but each time he does it in a different way. In the first chapter, he shows Isaiah a vision. In the second chapter, it says he shows Isaiah a word. Don't know quite how to differentiate that from the vision, but the second chapter, he sees a word. In the 5th chapter, he gives Isaiah a song. All of Isaiah chapter 5 is a song. Here's a song to instruct you, Isaiah. In the 6th chapter, he gives Isaiah a sneak peek into the heavenly boardroom. Isaiah gets to overhear the council, what in mythology is called the council of the gods. Isaiah gets to see God on his throne with other thrones, and he gets to overhear this message. So in many different ways. That's just the first 6 chapters of Isaiah. Let's think about the different types of literature that God used. God used poems. God used love songs, like the book Song of Solomon. Boy, try figuring that thing out. I don't know if we'll preach through that book or not. Try figuring that out. Weird way for God to communicate to his people. Love songs about a guy and a lady that's scantily clad. Interesting way to communicate an idea. Apocalyptic literature. Beasts coming out of the water. Beasts walking on the land. Apocalyptic literature. Many different ways that God chose to give his message. Another thing that God would do, prophetic dramas. He would have one of his prophets go out and act out a certain dramatic event in front of all of Israel. Go put on a little play for Israel. Let me remind you some of them. Jeremiah was told to set up a bunch of jars where everybody could see them. And once he had everybody's attention, I want you to go through and smash all of those jars to pieces. What's that supposed to mean? That was Jeremiah 19:10. Here's another one. Jeremiah, I want you to go walking around through Jerusalem with a yoke on your shoulders. I want everybody to see you walking around with a yoke on your shoulders, as though you were a beast of burden doing hard labor. What was that supposed to mean? Interesting. That was Jeremiah 27. Ezekiel, here's a gross one. Ezekiel chapter 4 and verse 12. What was Ezekiel supposed to do? He said, Ezekiel, I want you to get up where everybody can see you, get everybody's attention, and I want you to bake your bread over dried pieces of human feces. Just in case you think I'm making it up, that's Ezekiel chapter 4 and verse 12. I want my people to see you cooking your food with dried pieces of human feces. What message was that supposed to communicate? Ezekiel, I want you to lay on your right side for 390 days, and then I want you to flip over and lay on your left side for 40 days. What in the world? Strange. God communicated in many, many different ways, he says. Ooh, here's an interesting one. Isaiah. Here's the quote. Isaiah chapter 20, verses 1 through 6. Isaiah, I want you to walk around buck naked and barefoot for 3 years. What are you supposed to get out of that? Seems inappropriate, doesn't it? Let me explain it so that we're not repulsed. When enemies came in and overtook a nation, and they marched you out of the nation and marched you into exile, they would strip off all of your clothes and march you into exile naked as a way of humiliating you as a nation. Nakedness represented exile and humiliation. And I want you to show Israel what they're in for before I actually do it. That's the idea of many ways. Crazy ways. Just in case you're wondering, was the message always clear? Was it effective? Was it effective to talk to people like that? Well, no, it wasn't. It was always partial. It was always something to struggle with. Let me give you a text, 2 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 14, that says, no, this kind of stuff was hard to understand. It was hard to get a good picture of the God that you worshiped when he was communicating in these archaic, odd ways. It was like having a veil over your eyes so that you couldn't really get to know God that way. Look at what Paul wrote to the Corinthian church, 2 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 14. But their minds were hardened, for to this day, when they read the old covenant, the same veil remains unlifted, because only through Christ is it taken away. Yes, to this day, whenever Moses is read, a veil lies over their hearts. But when one turns to the Lord, that veil is removed. So, was the old way of speaking sporadically, piecemeal, and in many ways, dramatic events, apocalyptic events, was that the best way to get to know your God? And he says, no. You might learn something, but to learn about God in the old way is like having a veil over you where you can't see things clearly. You can't really make out who He is. You can't really get the full, accurate picture of who God is in that old way. When God used to speak that way in the old days. And interesting, Paul says in Corinthians, only when you turn to Christ is that obscurity and vagueness removed. And then you get to see God for who He really is. Well, fortunately, if we go on to verse 2 in our text today, he says the exact same thing about Jesus. So that's the old way. Let's go to verse 2 in our text today. But in these last days, He, that's one of our pronouns. I'd put a thing around it. This is God. He, being God, has spoken to us by His, being God, His Son. In these last days, He speaks to us through His sons. He has changed the modus operandi. He has changed the way He reveals Himself to His children. And now He uses a different method to reveal Himself. The way He reveals Himself now, he says, is through His Son, Jesus Christ. When Jesus came into the world, all things had changed. God's way of communicating with men has changed, and it would be far superior to the old way. And I'm fascinated. You know, there are some faiths today, and like I told you, there's a lot of theology in this text. And so we're going to have to draw some lines because that's what the author is teaching us. He says, to this day, whenever people read Moses, that veil still remains. It's only when you come over to Christ that the veil is removed. I might just point out, I can't remember which church it is. So maybe I shouldn't say. I think it's Seventh-day Adventist. That makes sense. Seventh-day Adventists believe you still have to observe the Sabbath on the seventh day. I believe, but they still believe that we are under the old covenant. They still believe that the Mosaic law is still what we are under, and that's why they still worship on Saturday, seventh day. But notice, Paul said, as long as you are living under that rubric, you'll never come to know God accurately. It's only when you turn to the new rubric, the new covenant, this new age that we're in and this new way that God is communicating to His people, and He says, then you see God in all of His actual splendor. That's an important theologic issue. Now, he says, in these latter times. That's always a strange phrase. People always want to know what that is. So let's define these last days. He's saying in these last days, as though He is under the last days. That makes you wonder, well, what are we under? Are we under the last days? What is the last days? So just to make this very clear to us, in the Jewish mind, there were only two ages. And to make it as simple as possible, there was the age before the Messiah, and then there is the next age, the age that comes after Messiah. So we put Jesus, death, burial, resurrection, and cross right here in the middle. The age before, they were looking forward to what they call the last days. The last days in the Jewish mind was the period after the Messiah came, not the period they were in. Only two ages. Our text today, our opening statement in Hebrews, distinguishes those two ages. He says, long ago, in that time, and then he fast forwards, but today and now. So for the Hebrew author, today and now is the Messianic age. It is the time after the resurrection, all of this time up until the end of time. And this age that he is in is called the last days. The last days is a phrase that's left over from the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, before Christ had come, they were looking forward to what was called the last days, the days after the Messiah. We are living in the days after the Messiah, in the last days. Let me show you how they would have used this in the Old Testament. Micah chapter 4 and verse 1, I believe. And it shall come to pass in the latter days. It's the same phrase. Latter days, last days. It's all the same thing. In the last days, the mountain of the house of the Lord will be established as the highest of the mountains, and it shall be lifted up above the hills. And he's saying in the last days, when the Messiah comes, those days are going to be high and exalted and lifted up. He's saying what they're going to experience in those days is way better than anything we've got to see in these days. Micah chapter 4. Yeah, the Hebrew author draws it out long ago and now. The age of the prophets and the age of the Son. Another way to look at this, one of my favorite ways to see the difference is the old days, the days of the prophets, was the days that I call types and shadows. All of the Old Testament was types and shadows of what they call the latter days, our days that we're living in, latter days, the Messianic time, because in the Messianic time, we have the actual realities. So for example, crossing the Red Sea was a type and a shadow of baptism, escaping bondage. The high priest offering and sacrifices in the Old Testament was a type and a shadow of Jesus becoming our high priest and becoming our sacrifice. The old Holy of Holies in the temple, which you could only go into once a year, was a type and a shadow of heaven where no man could enter until the one high priest came and he entered the true Holy of Holies, heaven. We are now living in the spiritual realities. And back then, it was only the types and the shadows of the spiritual realities that we live in now. We go on to the other part of our verse. He has spoken by His Son. I would put squares around has spoken. It's very critical. In the Greek, it is written differently, and it's specifically past tense. This is one of those technical moments where it's good to recognize has spoken in the past tense, indicating that it's already been done. The way God is going to speak to us in these last days has already been done. It's already been spoken. In Jude, we see the same kind of a phrase. In Jude chapter 1 and verse 3, halfway through the verse, he says, "Contend earnestly for the faith which was entrusted," here's your phrase, "once and for all." to the saints. Now, he says in these last days, he has spoken to us through the Son. If we want to know, well, then how long a period does that cover where Jesus was giving his children the direct message from God? And I would say, if you look at the first verse of Revelation, let's look at it. I didn't give it to you. Revelation chapter 1 and verse 1. Revelation chapter 1 and verse 1, the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave to him so that he could show it to his servants. So Revelation chapter 1 and verse 1 is the last time that God spoke through his Son, 96 AD. And the fact that the Scripture tells us it was once and for all, it's already happened, means that there was a finality in the frequency. There is no more frequency after the book of Revelation, 96 AD. There are no more revelations. He has already done it once and for all through his Son. Now, we are going to want to hold on to that. That's an important piece of theology for us, because if anybody shows up after 96 AD claiming to have a new revelation from God, we need to have the discernment to look at the text and go, I'm sorry, you must be a fraud, because the revelation has already been given once and for all through the Son. So if you're popping up and saying you're a prophet and you have a revelation for me, you're false. If you're popping up speaking a tongue saying you have a new revelation for me, you are false. Because God has already spoken through the Son, and Scripture says it's done. Therefore, when someone believes in the Quran, because Muhammad said, I'm the new prophet of God, I'm the last prophet of God, and here is a new message from God. That message was given in 600 AD. Should the Christian have a discernment with the text of Hebrews and other texts to know God's final revelation through Jesus was in 96 AD in the book of Revelation? Somebody shows up in 600 AD. Can he be genuine or is he a fake? Let's fast forward to 1800 AD. 1800 AD, Joseph Smith shows up and he's copying the prophet Muhammad. Did you realize that? I'm the last prophet of God and I have a new revelation from God. That's exactly what Muhammad did. 1800 years after Christ, is he genuine or is he a fake? You should know that because the text is very clear about how God has made his revelation to his children once and for all in the past tense, already done. Important implications of the text. He goes on in the second part of verse 2. Whom he, here's another one of the pronouns for God. What did he do? He appointed the heir of all things, and through whom he, that's God, God created the world through him. This verse would take a little bit of time to sit with, but notice Jesus is the heir of everything. He's going to inherit everything. But what's really strange about that is the next part. Wait, everything that exists was created through Jesus. What? Jesus made everything, so Jesus is going to inherit everything? Jesus is going to inherit the same thing that he made back in the beginning. You might wrestle with that a little bit. I'm going to get back what I made. But here's the beauty in that passage. If Jesus has been promised to inherit that which he created, if he's the heir of the very thing that he made, do the first words of Genesis say, and everything was terrible and messed up? You see, what Jesus made was not a fallen, broken world. What Jesus made was something that God looked at and said, it's very, very good. There is a beauty in that reality that now we have an eschatology. What is the end going to look like? Well, in the end, Jesus is going to inherit, Jesus is going to receive his creation in the beauty that it originally existed, not in the brokenness that has transpired since then. Jesus is going to get back the very thing that God looked at and said, it is very good. That has profound theologic implications for us. When we look forward to the future, what is our forward look into the future? Is it optimistic or are we pessimistic? Do we have the sensation that things are going to get worse and worse and worse until we just can't wait to get out of here and then we leave and go to heaven? Or is it like he says here, he's going to inherit what he created? Meaning God is going to fix and restore all of the things that corrupted the beauty of the original creation. I'm not saying it's necessarily going to be exactly like the Garden of Eden in Genesis, but I will say this, and you should make a note of this. We see the Garden of Eden in Genesis, original form. Do you know we also see the Garden of Eden in Revelation in its glorified, renewed, changed, glorious form? That's your eschatology. Something beautiful and glorious in Genesis that was ruined throughout the history of mankind, that Jesus is going to get back in a glorious, beautiful, righteous form. So our outlook into the future is optimistic, victory, overcoming. A little quote for you. The creation does not disintegrate in violence and chaos and futility. It endures as a holy inheritance. Human beings do not end up in meaninglessness. They end up as the treasure of the beloved Son. Just remember that phrase. The Eden that we saw in Genesis is restored in the Eden that we see in Revelation. Number 3, we'll move down to verses 3 and 4. Now you want to focus on the pronouns that talk about Jesus. Use those as little launching pads. So let's go. Hebrews chapter 1 and verse 3. Now we're talking about Jesus. He is the radiance of the glory of God. He is the exact imprint of his nature. He upholds the universe by the word of his power. I love that we finished off the book of Matthew. All power and authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. And here we see it again. This section of our text, verses 3 and 4, are a Christology. They are a Christology in that they are the study and the revelation of who Jesus is. Who Jesus is, what Jesus is. And that's what we want to key into. The first part, it says, and he is the radiance of the glory of God. He is the radiance of the glory of God. He is the radiance means he is the personification. He is the residual effect that you can see of the invisible God. Jesus made it possible to see in Him exactly what the invisible God is like. It's a more majestic and it's a better way for us to see God than the old way of the prophets and the fathers, who could only see God through a veil, barely being able to figure Him out. But in Jesus, we see the full, radiant, visible glory of what God is like. And He says that's the best way to see God. This idea of seeing the glory, there's an Old Testament phrase called the Shekinah glory. In the Old Testament, the prophets were aware of this idea, the Shekinah glory. The Shekinah glory was any time God would make some aspect of Himself. Remember, we said in many ways and in different forms. And back then, some of the ways that God showed His glory to people was being a pillar, some kind of a cloud in the sky that led Israel safely through the wilderness. That's an idea of who I am. Kind of a rough idea, isn't it? When God led them with a pillar of fire at night, that was His glory in that pillar of fire. That was you getting to visibly see some aspect of me, but a strange, unclear aspect of God, isn't it? When the tabernacle was first made, it said Moses and the people couldn't go into the tabernacle because a big cloud came and filled the entrance of the tabernacle, and that was the glory of God. God loves to let people see Him, but in the Old Testament, the glory that people saw was vague and weird and veiled. So He says, now the glory of God is getting to see not a cloud, not a pillar of fire, not a bunch of smoke. Now you actually get to see God by looking at Jesus. The veil is removed and you get a clear picture of who God is, and you don't need further revelations because Jesus is the full revelation of God. He goes on to say He is the exact imprint of His nature. This idea of an imprint in this day was they would take some kind of a picture of something that they had carved out, and they would press it into a soft metal. And the image in that soft metal is the exact image of the stamp that was used to make the impression. Jesus is the piece of stamped metal. God is the stamp, and God has made Jesus look exactly like Him. Jesus Himself said, have I been with you for so... Somebody asked Him, would you show us the Father? Jesus says, have I been with you for so long and you don't get it yet? If you've seen me, you have seen the Father. Jesus is the best way to get to know the fullness, the radiance, the glory, and the imprint of God's nature. I want to remind us, He's giving all these godly attributes to Jesus. And let's remember some of the ones that we learned from the book of Matthew. From the book of Matthew, we learned that Jesus, one of the people that was with Him, said, who is this guy that even the wind and the waves obey Him? That's not a mortal man. Only God can tell wind and waves what to do. Who is this guy that forgives sins? That's something only God can do. Who is this Son of Man that can ride on the clouds of heaven? That's something only God can do. And now it says Jesus has been given the name that belongs to the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, the name of God, given the name Yahweh. All of this is Christological to make the deity of Christ unmistakable. That's another theological reality that is painted for us. He is the exact reproduction of the God of heaven. He is the exact image, the exact reproduction. He is the authentic representation. And in Him, you can see all of the Shekinah glory of God. I want to stop just for a moment there. He's expressing, notice when we talk about someone being a chip off the old block, what we're referring to is a son that looks just like his dad. Referring to a boy that he walks just like his dad. He twiddles his fingers just like his dad. He uses expressions just like his dad. He contorts his face sometimes just like his dad. Now here's an important theological reality. When the authors talk about Jesus being a chip off the old block, he's just like his dad, are they ever talking about Joseph? Nobody ever talks about how much Jesus reminds them of Joseph, just like his dad. Nobody ever compares Jesus to Joseph because Jesus was no mere mortal. Jesus looked like his transcendent Father, the God of heaven, which makes Jesus deity, which makes Jesus godlike. The world has to accept Jesus not as a guy that was a good guy and a nice guy, maybe even a prophet. That's not acceptable. Jesus was exactly the same quality as God of heaven. To say that he was only like his father Joseph is to say a lie, is to say a blasphemy. If he was just a mere man, then he was only like Joseph. But if he was God in the flesh, then he was exactly like the God of heaven. The author of Colossians painted the same exact picture of Jesus. He didn't resemble his earthly father, if that's what we should call Joseph. He resembled the God of heaven. Colossians chapter 1 and verse 15. He, Jesus, is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. That little section of text right there takes some work to understand what that means. People have misused it. Don't have time to do it today, but that text right there takes some work. Verse 16, for by him, Jesus, all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Paul there to Colossians has told them exactly what the Hebrew author is telling us in verses 1 through 4. Part 3, verse 3, second part of verse 3, back to the pronouns. And he, Jesus, he upholds the universe by the word of his power. Man, I didn't give you this one either. Sorry, guys. Old Testament texts, who is the one that props the earth up and holds it by his power? God the Father, Yahweh. Yahweh is the one that sits above the earth and holds it together by his power. And now, another attribute to Jesus, he's just like his Father. Jesus is the one that holds the earth together by his power, unmistakably a divine formula. Part 3, He holds up the universe and the world by His power. That is what God does. So again, He's attributing divinity to the man, Jesus of Nazareth. Going on, verse 3b, atonement and exaltation. And after He made purification for sins, He sat down at the right hand of majesty on high. Again, guys, He has just drawn a theological line in the sand, and we're going to have to learn to get discretion from this. He says after He made purifications for sins, which means the atonement for sins, the payment for sins, has already been done. So after that was done, Jesus sat down. Here's something interesting. Do you know that the high priests in the temple never get to sit down? They never get to sit down because their work is never done. Their work is never done because the work that they did could not actually take away people's sins, so they had to continually do the same work over and over and over and over again, year after year, sacrifice after sacrifice. It had to continually be repeated. But he says that when Christ came, Christ only had to make one sacrifice, the sacrifice of Himself. And that paid for sins. And when He got done with that, He sat down. I love recognizing the imagery, the hustle and bustle of the priests in the temple that can never stop, versus the single act of Jesus that allowed Him to sit down and be done forever. Let me explain what the ramifications are of that. I'm going to talk about the diocese. The diocese is the hierarchy of the Catholic Church. The priests and all those people in positions of power. I want to explain something to you. Do you guys know they don't call it going to church or going to worship? They call it going to Mass. There's a reason why it's different than what we do. If you ever get to witness a Catholic service, maybe you want to try to go see one for yourself. But you'll notice in Protestant congregations, we have a pulpit. And that's where the majority of the work takes place. But if you walk into a Catholic building, you notice they might have a lectern off to the side. But in the middle, there's a tall, wide table, and the table is called an altar. Do you know what they do on altars? They offer sacrifices. When I was little, I was in the church and I was called an altar boy because I got to assist the church. I got to assist the priest. Because most people don't recognize this, but the priest, when he takes the wafer, the communion, and the wine, he is offering a sacrifice for the sins of the congregation. The Catholic Mass is the priest offering sacrifices for the sins of the congregation. Now, if you have a beloved friend or family member that is in that institution, they are being taught incorrectly. Because doesn't the text say us, once Jesus had made the purifications for sins, He sat down. Isn't it done? Didn't Jesus on the cross, when He was about to breathe His last, didn't He say, man, there's a lot more I need to do? It's finished. Finished. The world's sins have been paid for. Justification has happened. So let me get a little bit deeper into the Mass. Have you ever heard the phrase transubstantiation? That would be a good word to look up in YouTube sometime. Transubstantiation. Transubstantiation is, in the diocese, the power that is given to the priest to do a miracle in front of the congregation. When we take the wafer, we are saying that it symbolizes Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. But transubstantiation means that when the priest holds up that wafer, as soon as the bell rings, a miracle happens. The priest is pulling Jesus down out of heaven. The real, actual Jesus, not just symbolic. He is literally pulling the actual body of Jesus out of the heavens and putting it into the wafer that he holds up. And he says that wafer actually becomes the real body of Jesus that he has just yanked out of heaven and put into this wafer. And then he puts the wafer down on the table. He bows down. He does some little things. He breaks it. And he says he has offered Jesus again. He has just sacrificed Jesus again for the sins of the congregation. Now, we're not picking on people. We're just saying that if you have friends or family members that you may want to learn this information, this apologetic, this theology, because they are being told that Jesus' once and for all sacrifice on the cross was not enough. It won't get you to heaven. You have to have a priest that will continue offering sacrifices for your sins, or you're not getting into heaven. Do you want your friends and family members to be stuck and controlled by that kind of bondage? We want to free our friends and family members from the bondage of thinking that they have to go to Mass so that a sacrifice can be made for their sins. And those sacrifices happen every day in truly Catholic nations. They go to Mass every day. Jesus is being re-sacrificed every day. It's important to know that. After he was done making purifications for sin, Jesus sat down. And he's done. Last part of the verse, verse 4. Having become as much superior to the angels as the name that he has inherited is more excellent than theirs. Here is where a person might want to stop and say, man, I have seen the glory of verses 1 through 4. Maybe we've scratched the surface just a tiny bit to recognize the beauty of only 4 verses opening this book. I would exhort you and beg you at home, in your hammock, at the park, sit with these 4 verses, meditate on them, figure it out. What does verse 1 say about the past? What do the pronouns in verse 2 say about God? What do the pronouns in verse 3 and 4 tell me about Jesus? And make it your own. But here in verse 4, he says, oh, and by the way, Jesus is better than angels. Now, if we're doing our due diligence, I might want to go, what in the world? How did angels ever come? Why did he mention that? I would have never thought of that. Who's better, the angels or Jesus? Why did he end with that? He ends mentioning angels because he's going to transition into the next pericope. And he has to explain to his audience something about the angels. So we're just going to stop right there, and we'll talk about angels next week. Bless you guys.